that, I'd like to hand it over to Cliff.
Great. Thanks, Jeremiah. Um, so it's a real pleasure to be here today. And the goal of this talk is to talk a little bit more about social media and to basically start off at a high level, kind of describing what social media is, what are some of the larger trends in social media, and then to start to drill that down into especially how nonprofit organizations have used social media to meet their organizational goals. So use the Q&A to have questions as we move along, and I also have the chat window open if anybody wants to respond through the chat window. So as Jeremiah said, I'm a professor here at the School of Information at U of M. My PhD is in information. If you, like many people, have never heard of information as a field, we basically study how technologies of different types shape how people share information and communicate with one another. The way that's taken place in my research is to look at social media more broadly. So I've been studying social media for, 15 years now. Probably before we started to call it social media, back when it was Web 2.0 and even before that. It's a rapidly changing field, so it stays pretty interesting. But I know because it's rapidly changing, it can often be disorienting and confusing. So hopefully what we're going to do is try to talk a little bit about what are some common characteristics of social media, what do we even mean when we talk about social media, and then drill that into how do we use it effectively for our organizations. So let's start off with this broad question of what is social media. And I think, if you said, what is social media, you're going to have a series of platforms in your mind immediately, right? Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, maybe LinkedIn, depending on what kinds of your own personal use look like. You probably already have an idea of what social media is, but I would try to get you to expand your idea to what it is to multiple platforms, but also into multiple types of people and multiple activities, right? So a site like Flickr, which focuses on how people share their photos, is as much a social media site as a site like Instagram or a site like LinkedIn. So, thinking about this broad range of network technologies that now allow us to communicate is a great way to think about how we can then use it to meet our own interpersonal and organizational goals. Three common characteristics that define everything that's under social media are user-generated content, direct user-to-user interactions, and bundles of applications. So that's pretty nerdy. I know it sounds a little too professory. So what I'm going to do is break those out a little bit separately. And what I basically mean by user-generated content is if you think about any social media site, they're all basically empty spaces waiting for us to fill them out, right? It used to be that content was created by experts and that content was usually pretty good. But now social media has made it so that we're all producers of content. Now, all being producers of content really changes the game in terms of how we interact with each other's content, right? This is sometimes called the prosumer market, that we're both consumers and producers of information in social media at the same time. Most of these platforms are free, but so is the work that you put into them, right? Facebook would be a pretty empty space if we weren't constantly adding our content. Instagram would be a ugly space if we weren't adding our pictures. So there's very much a mutual agreement between users and these platforms about how content gets generated. The second strong characteristics of social media is that it's direct user-to-user interaction. Now it's hard to underestimate how big a change in kind of our media market this has made. It used to be, of course, that broadcast media had gatekeepers who controlled what information was shared with a wide audience and to the public. That had a lot of great effects, right? Editors could say what was good information and what was bad information. There were basically people who said, well, maybe that's not the right letter to the editor to post in our newspaper or something like that. And that's changed with social media, where now, of course, anybody can tweet or post or share a photo or whatever. And that means that we're really in a space where you have an audience. Now, what that audience effect means is, again, it creates a performative pressure in social media that's different than it would be in like interpersonal communication. Sure, we're always trying to act nice with one another when we're one-to-one, but when you're up in front of an audience, you act a little bit differently than you do when you're with a group of friends or with your family. And that direct user-to-user interaction means social media is largely about audience. The third one is the nerdiest of them all, and that is the bundles of application. And what I mean by that is, if you think about a site like Facebook or Twitter, it's not one thing. It's actually like a toolbox filled with tools that help you share information and communicate. In the literature, we call these tools affordances, right? Because they afford different actions. They basically enable a person to say like, oh, I can broadcast this message, or I can send a direct message to a friend, or I can archive this or I can vote on this. All of those little individual tools that make up any given social media platform all have different effects on how we actually interact with one another. So a great example I often use is, if you look at Facebook, you have to agree to be friends with somebody on Facebook, right? You both have to kind of agree. On Twitter, you can follow somebody without them following you. In the early days of Facebook and Twitter, what this actually then ended up meaning was that Twitter became much more popular with celebrities because celebrities want you to follow them. They don't want to follow you. Whereas Facebook became more popular for interpersonal relationships where people want to actually have a mutually agreed relationship. So these features, these both social and technical features, really shape how people end up using these social media platforms. These affordances, often we break them out into both software and hardware features. So with the hardware is especially important to think about for a moment. Lots and lots of interaction is taking place now on mobile, right? And when you think about the affordances of a phone that are different now than they used to be, everybody now carries in their pocket a video recorder, a camera, a geolocated device. And that has changed the nature of how we produce content. I remember doing video production back in high school with a giant camcorder, and it was a lot of work to get that done. Now, of course, everybody pops a phone out of their pocket the minute anything interesting happens, and you go to public events, and it's pretty much a sea of blue screens recording the action. So what does that mean? When these hardware devices have gotten cheaper and more available to people, they're not ubiquitous yet. What does that mean for how we actually create content? The features of software are even more important. When you take a look, for instance, at a typical person's Facebook page, all of this is really a set of different features, and I called out a few of them here, right? So if you think about the feature to be able to post photos, Facebook didn't always have this, right? And it was very quickly after they initially posted this that it became the most common photo sharing platform on the web. The ability to archive my posts, the ability to go back into an archive of posts and search things, the ability to refer to another user and tag them in a comment, the ability to comment or to like or to promote. All of these things are basically different features that different social media platforms have that allow us to shape how we do things. And what's really interesting is that those features really differ when you look at how software is constructed on the desktop, which was the previous screen, versus the mobile application, which is this screen, right? So most of the big social media platforms are now split between desktop and mobile, though increasingly social media is being created on mobile only. And the how they set up these things up and what kinds of tools they make available can differ vastly between the two platforms. A good example of this is on Facebook. Their desktop application is kind of one big application. On mobile, they started to split applications out. So you might have been annoyed, for instance, in having to use Facebook Messenger separate than Facebook's app on your phone. That's a specific business strategy they have to take these important features of their platform and to basically divide them out into smaller applications that exist on your phone. They recently did this with their events application too. So you can take different bundles of these tools and you can reassemble them in millions of different ways, and each one can support a different genre of social media. Right? When we think about the whole panoply of social media, if I add picture posting and commenting and liking, I could have Flickr. If I have commenting and content posting and pseudonymous interaction, I could get Wikipedia. The ability to support multiple types of both commercial, organizational, personal, creative activities through social media shows you just how widespread the applications have become. And there's still a lot of, I think, growth in the market. There are definitely new social media applications coming out all the time, but there's also been a little bit of consolidation in the market as well, which often happens with communication tools. So it is stabilizing a little bit. When you look at which companies are becoming dominant in the social media sector, it's a few different ones. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram is owned by Facebook, so same basic company. And those platforms now are the big movers, but there are still plenty of opportunity for smaller platforms to gain traction. So to look at that and to look at what are some of these trends in social media use, it's useful to have some data. I am a social media researcher, and we do like to have data for some things. And some of the best data we have is from the Pew Internet studies related to this kind of work. So what Pew has done is a series of nice nationally representative studies. These are phone surveys conducted in English and Spanish. And my research partner and I conducted this work with them. Last time we did this was in early 2015. And we were basically looking at how do people use social media at a national level, right? What are the trends? What have been the changes over time in how people use social media? So I like this data partially because it's nationally representative. It looks across platform. Sites like Facebook and Twitter will tell you how many users they have, but of course those are international users, and of course they have some incentives to kind of inflate their numbers. So these are some of the best data we have about what use actually looks like. So what does that use actually look like? What we see over the past 3 years is fairly consistent growth and fairly consistent pattern in who's using different social media sites. To back this up a little bit, in the United States, about 80% of people are connected to the internet, maybe 87 at this point. And the people who are not connected to the internet, it's largely because they've opted out of it. Of internet using adults, about 78 to 80% of them use social media of one type or another, right? And of the social media they use, the most common ones are by far Facebook. After that, the platforms look a little bit similar, right? So about the same number, 30% use LinkedIn, Pinterest, and Instagram, and then Twitter always kind of slides in at about 23%, 24%. Twitter is interesting because it has a small user base compared to a lot of other platforms, but because, again, early in its history, celebrities adopted it, it actually has a much larger shadow, and organizations adopted it as well. It has a much larger shadow than a lot of its other sites do, right? So I think Twitter has even though it has fewer users than Pinterest, it has more public impact because of the way that its features are set up. Other sites are growing that aren't included in this list. A good example is Reddit, which is a news aggregation site that's very popular in the kind of 18 to 24 male market. You have sites like Snapchat that's not included here. Snapchat's probably increasingly the most popular social media site for kind of the 18 to 25-year-old set more broadly. Yik Yak, which you may not have heard of, but it's an application that's very popular on college campuses that allows for anonymous chatting, is really popular. So, we collected some data on the largest of the sites that are out there, but there's still a healthy kind of ecosystem of social media sites that are really kind of taking place out in the world. When we look at demographic differences, even just amongst Facebook users about who uses and who doesn't, Facebook has become kind of a lingua franca across different types of groups. There are some minor differences. For instance, college-educated people are slightly becoming more likely to use it. There's some splits across income, but in general, as you can see from these numbers, it's the same group of people who use these sites. Or at least Facebook, sorry. When we look at basically the frequency of social media use and how often people are using these sites, Facebook not only has the most people on it, but it's the most frequently used multiple times per day. You've probably heard from the young people in your life that Facebook is no longer cool, and that's probably true. It's definitely not where I think, especially younger people, are living their kind of authentic social media lives, but it's still the most common site that people are using. And there's a few reasons for this. One is Facebook has done very good at making their tool important for logging into other online spaces. So people will often keep Facebook around, even if they're not posting on it. It's almost like your yellow page entry on the internet, right? It's kind of a default thing that you have and might check into once or twice a day. Instagram, especially for a younger set of people, is also really heavily used, and you can kind of see differences across these other sites. I think one of the most interesting things and trends of the last few years is that there's a growth in multiple social media site usage, right? So when we look at how many people use one site versus two sites versus three sites, we see quite a bit of the population moving to using multiple social media sites. And those multiple social media sites, that number has just grown. We have some updated numbers that aren't ready for publication on this yet. And more frequently, people are now using multiple sites to express their social media activity. What's interesting about people who are using two sites and more is that one of those sites is almost always Facebook, right? If you're going to use two social media sites, one is always Facebook. If you use three, one is Facebook. But then the sites after that are kind of different, right? We did some fancy analyses on these to show, all right, so what sites are co-occurring, who's using the same sites? And what we find that's very interesting is that, for instance, if you use Instagram as your second social media site, you're not also using LinkedIn ever, right? The users of LinkedIn and the users of Instagram seem to be very different populations. If you use Twitter, you're much more likely to be using Instagram than you are Pinterest as well. So there's some kind of consistent patterns in who's using these sites and how they set up their social media lives. So what are some of the most popular social media sites for organizational use? A lot of that was just about your interpersonal use, right? The numbers I just gave you were samples of individuals in their households and who's using what social media. So what social media sites are being most commonly used for organizations as opposed to for individuals? And these numbers look pretty common across a lot of the analyses that I've seen. So Facebook is still kind of the gorilla in the room in terms of being the big mover. Lots of sites use Facebook, and you can see why, right? You can post pictures, you can post content, if you look, for instance, on the the left-hand side of your screen, you can see all the different things you could do as an organization to engage with people. And Facebook's getting even better at this. For instance, they've made now native donation buttons that exist within Facebook's page. So you can donate to an organization directly through Facebook's interface, which you don't have to then go to a different site. Facebook stores the donation data, so it makes it much easier to donate. In general, in the past, social media has not been great about helping to solicit donations, but if they keep adding tools like this, it might become a more likely useful tool for people. So I think the sheer kind of power of Facebook in terms of the total number of users on it, as well as their ability to add multiple interesting tools that separately support these nonprofit groups, mean that Facebook is likely a pretty dominant platform, even though people may not be using Facebook in the same way they were 5 or 10 years ago. Another really common platform is Twitter. And Twitter is used by lots of different organizations. This is the World Wildlife Fund, which has a really active, really fun kind of Twitter presence that they have. But this is an organization that I support in the Ann Arbor area, for instance, that has, as you can see, many fewer followers. I think, WWF has 876,000, and these guys have 375. And so what do you use Twitter for separately from what you would use Facebook for? And what you would use Twitter for is more about messaging. It's about connecting and engaging with your users. It's about promoting content, and it's about building a network of relationships with like-minded audiences and organizations in your network. Right, so when we see groups like this who are using Twitter, you can see what they're doing is they're thanking donors, they're promoting some of their content, they're building relationships with other people, and that's what Twitter is really good for. The nice thing about Twitter is that it's usually fairly publicly viewable. So a Google search for an organization will often turn up their tweets, as well as there's very easy plugins from Twitter to your websites. So you could build into a front page of your website tweets as they appear, and that's all pretty seamless and easy to do. Increasingly, YouTube is becoming an incredibly important platform for people to use. So this is actually an organization that I help run, which the SIGCHI stands for Special Interest Group on Computer-Human Interaction, which is the fancy pants name that social media researchers have given themselves. And so what we've done on this site is we post videos of talks at our academic conferences and demonstrations of innovative new tools that we're building and things like that. YouTube across multiple nonprofits is growing in popularity because video is such a powerful engagement tool. The problem with video is that it's incredibly expensive to produce, right? So, you know, I am a lightweight video composer. Even as I mentioned earlier, we have our phones, so it's relatively cheap to create bad video. But to create good video that's high quality, that has production value, actually requires skill sets and tools that require investment. So video is one of those tough ones where it's very engaging for the people with the resources to make video available. It tends to have a nice impact of getting people to watch content and to view direct content from the nonprofit, but it's very expensive to produce and to promote. YouTube makes it easier. The other big site that a lot of, especially nonprofits use is Vimeo, because it doesn't have quite the same draconian licensing agreements that YouTube does. But in both of these cases, the hard part here is the production of the video. YouTube and Vimeo actually make it very easy to set up a platform to share if you have the capacity to do it. I would also say that YouTube probably is a little more advanced in allowing things like playlists and channels that allow for larger nonprofits to split up their video activity across multiple groups or parts of your organization and things like that. Another platform that's harder to use effectively, though lots of groups try, is LinkedIn. I think a lot of people really are compelled by LinkedIn because it, first blush, it has a really great story, right? It's kind of the grown-ups Facebook. It's your authentic self. People are endorsing you. It's your professional identity. And it does have a few very active forums and some great kind of content around organizations. The challenge with it is LinkedIn tends not to be a social media site where people check in every day, right? It's a site where you often go when you're looking for a job or when you're looking up information about a particular person. But as we saw in those numbers earlier, it's not a place where people really hang out and spend a lot of time. So, you know, and the problem with LinkedIn is how do you get engagement and how do you meet your organizational goals through LinkedIn? I would say it's probably not a bad idea to have a landing page on LinkedIn for any given organization and to promote the people who work for your organization or who volunteer for your organization. But it's really a hard problem to make LinkedIn an effective engagement tool. A question from the audience is basically, how do you get compelling video done cheaply versus boring videos done really well? That's a great question. Getting video content is a huge challenge in general. I think there's a few things you can do. I mean, one is to start off small and try to build. There's lots of actually great free editing tools. Part of the commitment that an organization would have to make is having somebody in the organization devote some of their time and attention to becoming the video expert. The tools are available and free. Really, the limited resource is your time in terms of getting somebody trained up on how to use those tools to create compelling video. What looks like compelling video, like what does that actually look like? I think the trick there is to look out what other groups are doing and see what you find compelling. One of the great things that nonprofits have is a wonderful ability to filter what is good content versus bad content. And this is a great opportunity if you find video from a kind of sister organization that looks really good, you could promote that on your social media channels and then also use that internally to say, this is where we want to go, right? This is the type of thing that we want to do. All right, so this is just a smaller organization that is trying to do the same thing. You know, you can be any size organization and have a LinkedIn type of presence. The problem becomes, of course, that, you know, how do you maintain it and how do you engage with it? Increasingly and growingly, I think Instagram has become a place for nonprofit work. As you probably know, Instagram is largely centered around photo content, right? It is almost entirely set up to show photos. Those photos often have comments attached to them, and people can share them and they can like them and interact on them in some lightweight ways. But the ethos of Instagram is really set up around photo sharing. So this is an example from Sierra Club, and is obviously Sierra Club is a giant organization. They've posted 1,600 photos of various types. It's worth checking out to see what kind of photos they find compelling. But here's a much smaller organization with only 110 followers, the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup. And you can see they're still doing a great job. The photos, luckily, with the depth of technology that now everybody has in their pocket for collecting photo information, there's some really great opportunities now to create photo content and to harvest photo content from your volunteers to share on an Instagram page. If some of you have a goal, for instance, of recruiting more young people to become volunteers for an organization, Instagram is probably a place to at least investigate spending a little bit of time and effort in learning about it. Because a lot of, especially young people, really use Instagram as a way they interact with organizations and content. It's very possible you can set up basically an organizational account on Instagram, and that allows you to do certain things like you can tag content, and you have common tags, and people could search on geocodes for photos and be able to find, for instance, where a specific photo was taken, and relate that, for instance, in this case, to the Detroit River. So there's a lot of really nice features for Instagram. I don't think, and it's still growing in use, I don't think a lot of nonprofit organizations really think Instagram as the first place they're going to go when they start a social media strategy, but it's actually a fairly decent kind of platform these days for that. So that's kind of the 4-5 big ones right now. You know, lots of people have tried different things. There's a few people who have tried, for instance, Flickr accounts, but not a lot of people use Flickr. There's a few nonprofits that have, because of their special topic, used other social media sites, but really Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn are kind of the top social media contenders at the moment for organizational use. Next, what I wanted to do is to walk you through a couple of consistent social media findings. You know, there are, at this point, you may not be surprised to know, tens of thousands of articles about how people use social media and what they get out of it, and does it hurt them or help them, and you know, what is the kind of use of social media more broadly. So I'm just going to walk you through a really distilled summary of that. Rather than a research talk, I've just made some propositions based off the thousands of articles on this I've read, and some of them I've written. So the key thing I always want people to remember from social media use is that use is incredibly heterogeneous, right? There's no one type of Twitter user or Facebook user. Facebook users, there's hundreds of different types. And we know this from the literature. I've done a lot of work with Facebook, and we've done some user profiling to see how people are using social media or using their platform. And you know, there's big clusters or bundles of how people use it. So there are people who just go on there to engage with games, right? Who just play games and share games with their friends. There are people who only would respond to personal content, right? They're only there to share information with friends or to communicate with friends. There are people there who only lurk, who only read content from other people. There are people who only engage in political conversations through Facebook. All of these are different types of uses, and interestingly, everybody thinks they use Facebook correctly and everybody else uses Facebook incorrectly. How you use Facebook really shapes the outcomes that you get from it. So you've probably at least heard news reports that Facebook increases depression and loneliness. That is true for people who only go onto Facebook for lurking purposes or for passive consumption. The idea here is what's called social comparison theory, that you go onto Facebook and everybody's presenting their best lives on Facebook and everybody looks happy and more active than you and they have better houses and whatever. And so you get sad because of that and get depressed. When actually what we find out is that if you interact with people on Facebook, if you actually comment on their posts, if you like their items, if you message them, those people who use Facebook very actively have much less depression than average and more benefits like increased social capital and more feelings of connectedness with their friends, right? So active use of a platform really is tied to these outcomes much more than passive use. The other thing, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is that social media is largely about production, right? It's impossible to underestimate how much the pressure of self-presentation, audience, and attention shape what people do on social media. So I often advise organizations when they're working with social media to think about the person you're trying to reach out to as a partner. How does your content help them with their brand? Right? Every one of the people on social media has a brand they're trying to promote through social media, some type of self-image they're trying to make publicly available. They're performing. We're all performing on social media, which isn't a bad thing. I don't say that as a negative, like that's a false type of self. We perform in a lot of areas in our lives, right? We act differently at work than we do at church or with our families or things like that. Social media is just another context in which people kind of have this front stage presence of themselves that they're shaping for an audience. So if you're working with a person who's on social media and you want them to do something, the best thing to think about is, how is my ask going to promote what they want on social media? How do they get something out of this? And that's an important thing to remember about social media, is that every consumer of social media is also a producer, right? The biggest thing, I think, to keep in mind about social media, and probably the hardest thing for nonprofit organizations that I've run into in the work I've done about this, is that social media is about attention. We sometimes call it the attention economy, because it's so important to think about, you know, when you post something on Twitter, your post is going to be immediately followed by a post from your favorite sports star, which will be immediately followed by a post from Kim Kardashian, which will be followed by a post from Dan Rather. Like, everything that we say then is followed by these things that are constantly trying to grab your attention. If you're looking at Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, it's like everybody is putting on their best content or their sexiest content in order to get you to pay attention to that in your limited amount of attention that you have, right? Because attention is the thing that's limited in social media, both for yourselves and for your audience, the people you're trying to move. They have X amount of time per day that they can spend on social media and pay attention to something or read something, but the total amount of things available for them to read or pay attention to is insanely growing, right? So how do you make your message stand out when it's going to be followed up by a message from Kim Kardashian? And I joke about Kim Kardashian because there's been some studies that have shown that when you look at what people actually search for, if you look at kind of Google searches, and you can do this yourself through Google Trends analysis on the Google site, people searching for famine, for conservation, for water, all of those things happens at a rate of 1/100th the number of searches that are out there for Kim Kardashian or Kylie Jenner or Hugh Jackman or whatever celebrity du jour is in the news, right? So it's a competition for that really precious commodity of attention out there. So let's then drill down specifically into social media and nonprofits. What are some good practices for nonprofits? One thing that the literature has shown is that social media is regularly used for three major activities by nonprofit organizations, right? One is information. So they inform stakeholders, they share a policy statement, they share data, they share news about something that's happening in the world. They promote their mission. So that's an important and probably the most effective use of social media, is basically as a micro broadcast platform to get information about your mission out into the world, about the things that you care about. There's also, however, a strong community building use of social media for nonprofit organizations. So it helps to basically nurture partners, grow networks of similar or like-minded organizations. create an identity in your audience that they are part of your organization. So there's a great community building aspect to social media as well. And then we also have this idea of action, right? A lot of people, especially nonprofits, say like, well, that's all great, but we actually, need money to accomplish things in the world, right? Like we don't want to accomplish something on Twitter. We want to accomplish something actually in the universe. So, they'd like to raise money or mobilize offline activity or get people to advocate for the organization in some way. Now, this is all great and it does happen, but it is the hardest thing to make happen through social media. I think when we look at those tools like that donate button on Facebook, is we can reduce the friction of doing this, the cost of doing this, we're actually going to get actually stronger and better opportunities to mobilize action through social media. But right now, it's still very hard. It does happen, but this is the hardest thing to accomplish. There's a question in the panel about when's the best time to try to make a grab for attention. The best time tends to be actually mid-morning on weekdays. It seems like most of the working world takes a social media break with their coffee break on Monday morning. So even though you might be a good worker and don't look at social media at work, you are a rare person, and most people do look at social media at work. So it's, I would say that actually after 10 p.m. is not a great time to promote messages. Thursday and Friday especially, is famously bad. Friday, Saturday, Sunday are famously bad for putting out messages. I would say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, midday to be on social media. All right, so my biggest advice for nonprofit organizations more broadly is to remind them that social media is social. What I've seen, the biggest mistake I think I've seen that nonprofit organizations do is they just treat social media as a broadcast medium, a micro broadcast medium. So that you look at some social media sites for nonprofits and it's like, we did this, this is in the news, here's the march that we're having next week. It's pretty typical what I call pamphlet content. Things that you could easily put into a newsletter somewhere. And 74% of NPOs use social media in exactly that way, right? There's some great research that has been done showing that that's the dominant use of social media. It's not the best use of social media. And there's lots of different, I think, scheduling paradigms that people have recommended for how you should divide up your content that you're posting into social media. The one that I like the best is this AAA one, which is a third of your updates being about appreciation, recognizing volunteers, donors, supporters, employees. The second third being about advocacy, which is sharing your content, doing that information role. Not just sharing your content, but sharing the content of other people who are in your network, right? If a sister nonprofit has done something cool, promote that, right? People like that kind of generosity of spirit and that broader advocacy as well. One of the things, the service you can provide that rises you above that attention filter problem that we have in social media is for you to be an expert filter for things that your audience actually cares about. Right? So that if they followed you, they probably care about the thing you care about, which is a great thing. Now you can use that hook in order to become an expert filter for other news or other actions by other organizations that your audience is going to be interested in. That can be awesome. And the third A, appeals. So, a third, I would say even less than a third probably of your social media content should solicit donations or direct help from your networks. A couple other really simple things to keep in mind with social media. One is, as much as possible, to create visual content. This doesn't have to be earth-shattering. The literature shows that pictures of people are more effective than pictures of natural scenes, which a lot of you, I think, represent environmental nonprofits, and you're all really enthused by pictures of rivers and trees, which is great. I also like those very much. But people in general, there's been a lot of gaze studies where they track where people's eyes go on a screen. If there's a person on a screen, eyes always start at the person, right? So think about how could you build people into your pictures, and how do you build active engagement by having images of different things available to your audience. The other idea for social media is actually I like the kind of truism that the best tool for social media is an editorial calendar, right? It's about having a plan for social media. And another mistake I think a lot of nonprofits make is that they solely hand off the responsibility for social media to one person. I agree that it's best for one person to coordinate the social media response for an organization, but really it should be, I think social media works best when it's an all hands on deck solution. Right? If this is something that's important to the mission of the organization, then it should be important to everybody in the organization. What the social media director should be doing is coordinating social media posts by everybody, not just by the social media person in the room. Right? And that's such an important message to get out there to your stakeholders and your nonprofit organizations, that the most effective engagement you're going to get is by bringing everybody on board. Right? It doesn't mean that everybody in your organization spends all day tweeting or posting to Facebook. It means that they're part of that editorial calendar. It means that they come up with ideas for content that they care about. It means that every so often their voice is included in your social media outreach. And then another thing I really want to make sure we hit is that mobile is the present and future of all social media activity. A couple of years ago, we saw a switch between mobile and desktop use of social media, and now something like 70% of all social media activity comes in through mobile applications. And I think that number is going to just increase over time. iPads and tablets don't play a major role in that. This is almost all smartphone types of access. So the biggest issue here is make sure your efforts are mobile friendly, right? When you're creating a website or you're thinking about a social media platform, how could you leverage social media through mobile applications? And that's just thinking about how are people using their mobile tools, right? They have their camera and their video camera with them on their phone. So you could do, for instance, like a scavenger hunt, or you could have people tweet some picture from their phone to you, or you could have people respond at a particular time. So there's a lot of ways to leverage mobile that is really a great thing for you to do. So there's a question on the platform or the chat about having your personal and work social media accounts open up on your mobile device at the same time. There are tools for that. I think Hootsuite now has a mobile application for that. Hootsuite is kind of a tool for that kind of calendaring and managing multiple threads of social media. It also provides analytics, which can be really important for you guys. There are tales of disaster as people forget to switch between accounts and tweet a personal message from the professional account. And lots of people have been fired for doing that. So it's something you still have to be careful of. There's still not great seamless tools for doing that. And then I think the biggest piece of advice I have for social media for organizational use for everybody, it's not just for nonprofits, I give this same kind of advice when I do the corporate rounds too, is how do you measure success of your social media activities, right? What is your metric for whether it was worth it or not to engage in a social media campaign? I think the lowest level thing that we do, and of course baseline, is how many likes did we get, how many followers did we increase, how many times were we retweeted, or how many times was our content shared on Facebook, whatever it happens to be. So those measures are, of course, baseline, and lots of tools provide analytics to help you really interpret and use those. I argue that you should go for a step further, which is to have a organizational goal, right? What it is that you want to accomplish, right? So is it that we want to bring X amount of money in by the end of the year? Is it that we want 40 new people per week to sign up for a newsletter? Is it that we want 17 more people to show up at our next meeting? I think you really want to tie social media outcomes, not just to whether it was shared, but to real life measurements of organizational success that you can tie into. That's going to mean you might have to do some additional types of research, surveys of your membership, focus groups, exit interviews with people who are coming to your public meetings, things like that. But it's worth it to know what types of your content are receiving the best reach for what you're really trying to accomplish. So, I'm just ending on a couple of like really quick hit pieces of summary feedback here. So make sure that you're interacting with other people's pages and profiles. you know, the best social media accounts, especially on sites like Twitter and Facebook, people are actually responding to their users. They're not just broadcasting content and acting like their audience doesn't exist. Create behind the scenes content, show setup for an event. One of the things I love right now, Michigan Radio is doing this cool thing where they're showing just basic video of their news broadcasters reading the news, which sounds like the lowest level, dumbest type of social media content, but it's hugely compelling because everybody always wonders what radio people actually look like. Ask questions in your social media posts. To get engagement, for instance, one of the best ways to get engagement is, you know, you need some sort of invitation to engage, and questions can do that. Track things. Make sure you have some numbers. Are you growing? Are you shrinking? What is actually happening? Create a citizen group. Create part of your volunteer group that's going to engage with your content. Because Facebook is about attention, it's almost like if you see an empty restaurant, you may not go into that restaurant because, you know, how might it be good or not. But if people are in there, you're going to think maybe I should go in. Social media sites can be the same way. You want to engage with some of your trusted members to make sure that they're signed up to pay attention to your social media posts and to give it a jump. And then it's also helpful, not just in your organization, but on your editorial board, to include a social media person, not your editorial board, I'm sorry, your board of directors, to have a social media person who's going to ask tough questions about, you know, is this effective? Do we have a strategy? What is our strategy? What are our goals for social media? So that's where I'm ending, and then I guess we can move directly into the Q&A section. And Laura, you want to curate which of these I get asked?
Sure. So the first question is for the webinar series itself. Was the December 2nd webinar archived at the GLCCN? And it is available there, and I will enter in the link to that in the chat box in just a moment. The second question is if you can create an event or professional showcase and invite interested professionals to that.
Sure, absolutely. Facebook events, I think, really has done some nice.
And that is, they clarified in LinkedIn.
Oh, in LinkedIn as well. So most of these sites now have these events, and events are a great, I think, general strategy for creating engagement, because what it does is it creates basically deadline pressure. I know I respond better to deadlines than to almost anything else. So the nice thing about events in terms of creating action in your user population is to use events to create that kind of deadline pressure. Both in LinkedIn, Facebook, both have these kinds of tools available now.
All right. The next question we have is kind of a statement here. So the easiest way to reach out to college age and young adult audiences with consistent messaging is through memes and humor. However, younger audiences are also very quickly turned off by inauthentic groups that appear to be trying too hard, while older audiences can see it as unprofessional. What is the best way to balance these two dynamics? How can we include both humor and professional content without turning either group off?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think part of it is to have kind of a multi-pronged strategy for reaching out to different audiences, especially if you know that your audience is kind of bifurcated and you're trying to reach a younger audience, but you still have kind of a professional or older audience that would be turned off by memes. I think where I've seen this used effectively in advertising more broadly is when people have a multi-pronged strategy to reach different groups within their kind of charter. So instead of thinking about your audience as one kind of chunk of people, and it sounds like you guys are already here in terms of thinking about the different audiences you're talking to, what are different media strategies for the big sections of your stakeholder groups, right? And so I guess my recommendation at the end of this is to do both, right? To use both social media like that uses humor and authentic voice, but then also have some of your content be more of this straightforward, just the facts kind of content. In general, I think nonprofits who balance that don't have much problem with turning off their users. As long as some of the content has some humor, as long as the millennials and younger see that there's a human actually behind the account, they're pretty happy. And I think for older users, what we've seen is as long as, and they get that you're also trying to attract younger people, and as long as there's, rich, information-filled content that's available to them, they're also pretty happy.
All right. The next question that we have is another statement here. So you showed the percentage of social media users and uses. In an outreach and social media strategy, where does email, constant contact or other, and text messaging fit?
Yeah, so I'll separate. That's a great question, Ken. Email is still king of the world, right? Email still is probably the most used of all of the digital technology platforms. I didn't include it in that list just because it's rarely thought of as social media, but of course an email list really shares a lot of those characteristics that I talked about early on. So yes, I think constant contact or Sugar CRM or any of these kinds of relationship management tools that are out there are hugely important. Customer relation management tools are incredibly important for nonprofits to still invest in and keep moving on. Text messaging is a little more iffy, right? So texting is one of those where people often feel bothered if they're texted by somebody who's not an interpersonal friend. Some of that differs quite a bit by generational differences, but in general, people think of text as largely just for personal use. So I, for instance, would not text my users for any of the nonprofits I'm involved with, but I would for sure email them all the time.
All right, thanks. Another question asks, when representing an organization, should people actually know the person behind the content or just the organization's face?
I think people should actually know the person behind the content. And when you see this with a lot of larger social relationship management groups these days, often, for instance, with Delta, because they now have a crew of Delta Airlines, and they have a crew of people who respond to tweets to the @Delta account. The actual social media person parentheses their name behind the tweet, right? So that it's clear kind of who actually answered that tweet. But it also provides this hook into like, look, this isn't some bot and it's not some kind of faceless organization. It's a guy named Tim who responded to my question, and that helps build trust in the organization.
All right, another user asks, what do you think about the effectiveness of paying for ads on social media platforms, specifically Twitter and Facebook?
I think they're good in very limited contexts for campaign types events, right? So Facebook, especially Twitter ads, it's not clear that their ad mechanism is finely tuned enough to really make much of a difference. Facebook, however, you do have some ability to really promote your organization. And again, what you're doing is, if you think about that stream of attention, you're basically providing a little boost for your organization in that stream, right? There's an algorithm behind each of these mechanisms, especially around Facebook's. And what you're basically doing is paying for that algorithm to highlight your content in favor of other people's content. It's kind of greasy, but it's the way these companies work.
All right, another question is, what do you think about hashtags?
I love hashtags. And especially if there's a skill set behind hashtags that is really hard to get right. But if you use them effectively, they can be great ways to connect yourself to that network of like-minded organizations and individuals that are very important. It's a great way to take your organization and attach it to a larger idea, right? So for instance, the protests in North Dakota really used hashtags effectively to organize action. The other thing that hashtags are great for are kind of these emergent immediate actions that you want to have take place. Great question, what's a hashtag? A hashtag is the # followed by a phrase. It's commonly used now. Has always been used in Twitter, and now it's very common in Instagram and on Facebook. It's basically a keyword, right? Is how my old library science degree would talk about it. It's a description of the content that then is hyperlinked to everybody else who has used that same keyword. So you could look at the keyword or the hashtag and search every other piece of social media content related to that. And that allows for people to create really kind of emergent ephemeral organizations around specific topics.
All right, well, we have a few minutes left here, and if you have any other questions, feel free to enter those into the Q&A box. In the meantime, Cliff, do you have that one slide with the link to the survey?
I do.
You want to forward to that? And we have another question here that asks, when launching a new website along with the social media campaign, do you recommend making it a large community event or just keep it to social media?
I think making it a community event is a great idea. And one of the lessons from my research community, we used to talk about online and offline lives, and we've been trying to move away from that because the boundary between being online and offline has degraded to such a point that it doesn't make sense to think about them as being wholly separate. In fact, a lot of the big media, the big companies who use social media have stopped talking about social media. They just talk about social, right? That they manage social relationships through a variety of channels, platforms like Twitter being one of them, but really what they do is social. It's not social media. I kind of like that in a way because it does remove, it's not the technology that's important here, it's just the way that we're reaching out to people that's important.
All right, we have another question that asks, is there a limit or a letter limit for good hashtags? And how extensive of a search should you use to make sure no one else is using a similar hashtag for unlike-minded events?
Yeah, I usually try a half dozen searches on a hashtag before I figure out who's using it. I try, like, what I mean is I try a half dozen variations of the hashtag I'm thinking of using to see who else is using it, especially to make sure it's not being used by somebody I totally disagree with, right? Like, and then I think a good limit for hashtag is between 6 and 12 characters. When you look at kind of the analyses of which hashtags become popular versus not, things over 12 characters drop off precipitously. Things below 6 characters are too general and not easy to hook onto. So the 6 to 12 featuring around 8 is a pretty good, 8 to 10 is a good benchmark.
Great. Are there any other questions out there? Feel free to type them into the Q&A box, and if we're unable to answer them before 1 o'clock, we'll email those answers out. So we'll wait a moment. And Jeremiah, did you want to close out the rest of the webinar?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap things up, and then any other questions that come through, we can follow up with those separately. So just like to thank everybody for joining us today. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with links to the website, recording of the presentation, and a short survey that's helpful for us to kind of get feedback about the presentations. We'd also like to remind people that there's an upcoming presentation, which will be the 3rd of our webinar series, and we hope you can join us with that in a couple weeks. And that one is focusing on improving collaboration using the GLCCN. So that concludes our presentation today. I'd like to thank you guys again and hope to see you here at our next presentation.
Thanks, everybody.